A special commission put together by Governor Baker has come out with recommendations towards solving problems on the MBTA. The recommendations allow the possibility of new revenue at some point, but the panel strongly urged reforms in T finances, management, and the line of command. There is also talk about getting more aggressive with raising fares. We have some reaction to the report from our guest, a senior attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation. We'd like to welcome Rafael Mares. Thank you very much for being with us, Rafael.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, talk about the diagnosis here and the perspective on, what are the worst offenders we're talking about?
Well, I think that the report gives us two things. It gives us, reforms that are necessary and also revenue. And I think so the diagnosis ultimately, even though the press coverage in the beginning, based on the leaks, couldn't tell that story, shows that we need both reforms and revenue, and they reject the idea that either one is sufficient.
So one of the things that seemed to be a great cause of outrage for people at that presentation at the State House was the money that was not spent. Now, I know this isn't exactly like cash in the closet here that he could just grab immediately,
right.
but it does seem that they were not exhausting their possibilities financially.
Well, I would say that it's really important that they identified this issue, and I'm glad that it's come to sunlight and that we can talk about it. What the report didn't do is tell us what the cause of that is, and we are all speculating at this point, and I really would like to get to the bottom of that. I think, if my understanding is correct, is we have a workforce development issue where we don't have enough engineers at the MBTA or outside that could be hired to help push out these projects. And if that's true, and if that's the case, and if it's also true that the MBTA is paying those engineers less than other transit agencies, and so they have a competition issue here, then we would know what the solution is, right? We need workforce development and we need higher salaries for those people in order to be able to push out more projects. It's really important to get to those details for us to be able to solve this problem.
What about all those missed trips that were blamed on absenteeism?
I think it is a terrible thing when a bus doesn't come around. I've personal experience with that, and I know that riders do too. It's a terrible thing that should never happen. That said, the absenteeism numbers that we've seen in the report aren't detailed enough, and they don't explain a lot of things. If you look carefully at the footnote, you will find that included aren't just vacations, which I think has been reported, but also military service. If somebody is away on military service for a year, that was averaged into those days. Same with paternity, maternity leave, and so on. So that number is a little deceiving, and I'd like to get to the bottom of finding out what the right number is. In the comparison to the peer agencies, the report doesn't even list what the peer agencies are, let alone what their definition of absenteeism is.
I mean, the good excuses you mentioned here, they probably have them in other places, and yet the commission was trying to say it seems that things are not run as well here.
I like to see improvements, and I'm sure that the agency isn't perfectly run, and I think it's really important to implement them as quickly as possible, but we won't be able to do that until we have a full understanding not just of the symptoms, but also the causes, and I'm afraid that is not in the report yet.
Now, one of the other things that they're also very eager to bring up was changing the chain of command, and I know we have a Department of Transportation board that is largely appointed by the governor, even though there's some overlap from one governor to the other. But it does seem as if what the panel wants to see is having the T basically on a shorter leash.
Well, the way I like to look at it is that there's going to be more involvement by the legislature and the governor through a board like that, and I think that part is a really good idea. There's been a lot of talk that T didn't do this, that T didn't do that. We should own our public transportation system. My hope would be that would be a positive change here. That said, I think we need to find out more specifics about who's supposed to be on that board and how that works. I'd like to see the Secretary of Transportation be on that board, and I'd like to make sure that all the members that are on that board are actually experts in some way related to the transit system. Now,
the other thing that was a little surprising, after all of the leaks talking about management problems and absenteeism, this is a panel that said, yes, we do see some new spending and eventually maybe some new revenue coming in here.
Yeah, it's not surprising if you've looked at the numbers for a long time. It's the only way it can work. If you go back to just 2013, where MassDOT came out with a pro forma of what the T's operating budget will look like going forward and what its gaps are, and the Joint Ways and Means Committee came up with a more optimistic calculation of that, and that's what the law was ultimately based on. They identified significant gaps and that were filled, and I'm hoping that the governor and the legislature will stick with that plan. So we were talking about $202 million gap this year, 260 the following, and the numbers only go up from there. So it's really important to get that under control in one sense, but all the reforms that are in the report don't add up to that kind of money, so additional revenue is clearly needed.
Well, one other thing that was also a little bit of a surprise, a depressing surprise, is that we had this figure before, $6-point-something billion in a backlog of repairs that needed to be done. Now the panel says, well, that might be lowball.
Yeah, I mean, the T said that themselves when they came out with that number. I was there at the board meeting when it was released. They said they hadn't considered all the different parts of it yet because they were still adding up some numbers and they were being careful. So that number could still be bigger. This is the consequence of underfunding, chronic underfunding since at least 2000 when with forward funding there was an attempt to put the T on the right course, but then the projections for the sale tax in which it's, it depends, they didn't come true and the energy costs went up and so on. So years and years of chronic underfunding, at least until 2009, if not beyond that. And so as a result, if you don't want to cut service and you want to keep serving your customers, and you have already increased your fares, you don't have a lot of options, and one of them is to defer maintenance, which is terrible, but it's the only option they were left with.
Well, even here in Boston, we've had a lot of serious talk about T expansion. We've talked about more robust service on the Fairmount Indigo corridor. We've heard about West Station in Allston, Brighton, expanding capacity at South Station. I mean, do we have to go more slowly with these things, maybe?
I don't think that's why we're in this sort of position that we're in right now. And more importantly, we need to look at what the needs of the system, of our region are. What kind of system do we need? And if we just build a system that fits into a certain budget, we ignore the benefits, right? We reduce costs, but we ignore the benefits of a system like that. Our economy depends on the T. We have population growth. We want to see economic growth. We need it for environmental benefits. Many of these projects were put in place in order for us to be able to comply with the Clean Air Act, which makes sure that there is a certain public health standard met for ozone, for example. So if we hadn't done any of these, we would have had to do other, probably more expensive and less beneficial projects.
What about fare increases? In recent increases, there has been very little loss of ridership and still maybe gains in ridership, despite the condition of the T. People in the panel and the administration up there saying, well, maybe we can squeeze a little harder in this.
The numbers that they had in the report, the fare recovery ratios were based on the whole system and compared it to peer agencies that don't have the 7 different modes that we have here at the MBTA. And if you compare the fare recovery ratio mode by mode, what you will find, we've done that, what you'll find is that the T is right in the middle of the pack for many of them, and for light rail, for example, it's actually leading. So they're getting a higher percentage of fares. So I don't know that that's the right approach, and quite frankly, after this winter, I don't know that there are many people standing on platforms willing to accept a fare increase, so I don't think that's the right way to go.
What is the right way to go?
Well, the planned fare increases that were put in place in 2013 in the Transportation Finance Act, they should remain in place. That they allow the T to raise their fares 5% every second year, and the T has done that once so far, and they would probably do this again next year. That allows people with limited budgets to plan ahead and know that these are coming, and allows the T to plan for what kind of income it's coming in, and doesn't make it a guess.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Rafael from the Conservation Law Foundation. Up ahead, we'll talk about a new summer learning program.